picture this. A private jet sitting on a runway in Chicago, engines running, ready to take a man halfway across the world so he'd never have to answer a single question again. He had his passport in one hand and a glass of scotch in the other, convinced that in less than an hour he'd disappear forever. He never made it onto that plane. Federal agents were already waiting at the gate. And the man who put them there wasn't a prosecutor, wasn't a cop, and wasn't even someone with a badge. He was a man this billionaire had personally destroyed 9 years earlier, a man he assumed would spend the rest of his life broken, forgotten, and powerless. He assumed wrong. This is the story of Richard Sullivan, a man who believed his fortune made him untouchable, and Nathan Reeves, the man who spent almost a decade proving him wrong. Before we get into it, if you're new here, this is Karma Chronicles, and if stories about consequences finally catching up to people who thought they'd escape them are your thing, sticking around and subscribing genuinely helps us keep making these. It tells us we're doing something right, and it pushes us to bring you even better stories next time. Okay, let's get into it. Chicago, roughly 15 years before that jet sat waiting on the tarmac. Richard Sullivan was already a name people whispered with a mix of respect and unease. He'd built a real estate and investment empire from the ground up, or at least that's the story he told at every gala, every interview, every donor dinner. In reality, large chunks of that empire were built on deals that would never survive daylight. Nathan Reeves was 34 years old when he crossed paths with Richard. Smart, hungry, and honest to a fault, Nathan had built a mid-sized logistics and investment firm that caught Richard's attention. Richard needed someone with Nathan's reputation for integrity to help legitimize some of his shakier ventures. Nathan needed capital and connections. On paper, it looked like the perfect partnership. For years, it worked. Nathan trusted Richard completely. He brought him into deals, vouched for him to other investors, and treated him like family. What Nathan didn't know was that Richard had been quietly funneling money through shell companies, bribing city officials, and, when necessary, making problems disappear through far darker means than lawsuits. Nathan was about to become one of those problems. When a federal audit started closing in on one of Richard's shell companies, Richard needed someone to take the fall. Nathan's name was already tied to the paperwork, since Richard had made sure of that months earlier, planting his signature on documents Nathan never actually reviewed in detail. Within weeks, Nathan was arrested and charged with orchestrating a multimillion-dollar fraud scheme. Richard testified against him personally, sitting in a courtroom with tears in his eyes, telling the jury how betrayed and shocked he was by his own business partner. It was, by every account, a performance worthy of an award. Nathan had no resources left to fight back. Richard had already frozen his accounts through a civil suit, drained his legal defense fund, and made sure every witness who could vouch for Nathan suddenly became unreachable or unwilling to testify. Nathan was convicted and sentenced to 9 years in federal prison. His wife left him within the first year. His daughter, only 6 years old at the time, grew up believing her father was a criminal. His name became a cautionary tale in Chicago's business circles, a warning about trusting the wrong people. Richard, meanwhile, expanded his empire using the very trust Nathan's downfall had bought him. Prison does something to a person. For some, it breaks them completely. For Nathan, it became something else entirely, a strange kind of forge. He spent the first 2 years angry, replaying every conversation, every signed document, every moment he should have paid closer attention. But somewhere around year 3, the anger turned into something quieter and far more dangerous to Richard, though Richard had no idea it was happening. Nathan started reading corporate law, financial forensics, federal investigation procedures. He wrote letters to old colleagues, testing which ones still had a conscience buried under their careers. He kept a small notebook, filling it with names, dates, and half-remembered details from his years working alongside Richard. He wasn't planning revenge in the way people usually imagine it. There would be no dramatic confrontation, no violence, nothing that could land him back behind bars. Nathan had learned the hard way that men like Richard don't fear anger. They fear exposure. So that became the plan. Not destruction through force, but destruction through truth. When Nathan finally walked out of prison at 43 years old, there was no one waiting for him. No family, No friends, no fresh start handed to him on a silver platter. He had a duffel bag, a small amount of savings from prison work programs, and a notebook full of names. Most people in his position would have tried to rebuild quietly, taken a modest job, and disappeared from public life. Nathan did the opposite. He moved back into Chicago, took a small apartment near the neighborhood where he used to run his old firm, and started reconnecting with the business world, carefully and patiently. He didn't approach Richard. He approached the people around Richard. Former employees who had been forced out over the years and were still bitter. Junior executives who had started noticing inconsistencies in the books but were too afraid to speak up. Investors who had lost money in deals that mysteriously benefited Richard personally while hurting everyone else involved. One by one, Nathan built relationships. He didn't ask for information right away. He asked about their lives, their families, their frustrations. Trust, he'd learned, isn't something you demand. It's something you earn slowly, the same way Richard had once earned his. It took nearly 2 years of careful work before Nathan had what he needed. Bank records that didn't match public filings. Testimonies from former employees describing cash payments made to city officials. A whistleblower from Richard's own accounting department who had kept copies of internal documents out of fear she'd eventually need protection herself. The most damning discovery came from a former security contractor who had once worked for Richard's private team. He described, in careful detail, an incident nearly 12 years earlier where a business rival who threatened to expose one of Richard's schemes was quietly paid off, then later found dead in what was ruled an accident. The contractor had never come forward before because he was terrified. Nathan spent months earning his trust before the man finally agreed to speak. Nathan didn't take any of this straight to the police. He knew Richard had connections deep enough to bury a single report before it ever reached a courtroom. Instead, he built relationships with investigative journalists, compiling everything into a case so thorough and cross-referenced that no single person could make it disappear. The first article dropped quietly, buried on a financial news site most people had never heard of. It raised questions about inconsistencies in one of Richard's older real estate deals. Richard's team dismissed it immediately, calling it baseless and politically motivated. But then a second article followed. Then a third. Each one built on the last, slowly connecting Richard to bribery, falsified records, and questionable deaths tied to people who had once threatened his empire. Investors who had trusted Richard for decades started asking uncomfortable questions. Behind closed doors, Richard's own inner circle began turning on him. People who had stayed loyal for years, mostly out of fear, suddenly realized the walls were closing in and started cooperating with investigators to protect themselves. The very culture of fear and control Richard had built for decades became the reason his empire collapsed so quickly once it started cracking. Federal investigators reopened the case that had once sent Nathan to prison, and for the first time, someone actually looked closely at who had really falsified those documents. Within months, Richard Sullivan's name went from being synonymous with success to being the subject of a national scandal. News outlets that once profiled him as a self-made success story now ran headlines about federal investigations, corruption, and a decade of buried crimes. His mansion, once a symbol of everything he'd built, became surrounded by reporters and investigators instead of guests and admirers. Business partners severed ties overnight. The board of his own company voted to remove him from leadership. Former friends who had once toasted his success at galas now refused to answer his calls. Richard tried everything. He hired the best lawyers money could buy. He attempted to flee the country. He tried to intimidate witnesses, only to discover most of them had already given sworn statements protected under federal whistleblower programs Nathan had quietly guided them toward. Every move Richard made only tightened the case against him further. That brings us back to the private jet on the runway. Richard, convinced he still had time to escape, was arrested before he ever left American soil. The charges included fraud, bribery of public officials, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy related to the death of the former business rival his old security contractor had described years earlier. The trial lasted months. Prosecutors laid out a case built almost entirely from the evidence Nathan had spent years quietly gathering. Though Nathan's name never appeared in headlines. He never wanted credit. He wanted the truth on record. Richard Sullivan was convicted on nearly every count. At 61 years old, he was sentenced to spend the remainder of his life in federal prison, stripped of his fortune through asset forfeiture and civil settlements owed to the people he'd wronged over decades. The man who once believed money could erase any crime and silence any witness sat in a courtroom and listened as a judge read out a sentence no amount of wealth could buy him out of. Nathan Reeves wasn't in that courtroom for headlines. He sat quietly in the back, watching the man who had stolen 9 years of his life finally face consequences that couldn't be bought off or negotiated away. He didn't get those 9 years back. He didn't get his marriage back. And he couldn't undo the years his daughter spent believing the worst about him. But slowly, piece by piece, he rebuilt what he could. His daughter, now a young adult, reached out to him after the trial, finally understanding the truth about what had actually happened all those years ago. Nathan never sought violence, never sought headlines, and never let anger consume the years he had left. He simply refused to let injustice have the final word. And in the end, that patience did more damage to Richard Sullivan than any act of revenge ever could have. If this story hit home for you, or if you just enjoy watching patience and truth win out over money and power, consider subscribing to Karma Chronicles. Every subscription genuinely motivates us to keep finding and telling stories like this one, and it tells us we're on the right track. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next one.